I'll say a welcome back to everybody who's been part of our afternoon panel. I think people are just getting themselves settled, so take a moment. I'll just make a couple of comments on Jeff's part of the presentation. That I hope it's clear that our intent in developing this playbook is to be inclusive. We want to have reasonable governance. We don't want to be asking everybody to be lifting the same thing. We want to figure out an efficient way to use people's time and expertise, but we're not trying to exclude anyone, and we're not trying to pretend that we know everything. Far from it. We more want to take an approach to leverage what is known from people within this province, from people from other jurisdictions, and pull it all together as a start, because I don't think we're intending to write something that covers every possible thing and will be perfect, but it's more to one of the points that Jeff made. We know there are going to be fires. When we started this project, we didn't know there was going to be a bad fire season in 2021, but it happened. And it would have been nice if we'd said, hey, if you're thinking about what you can do out there in terms of response to help salmon and aquatic ecosystems, here is a guide that anybody can use as they see fit. So it's our intent to proceed that way, to do it inclusively, and certainly be prepared to adapt and modify as we go. So with that, I will encourage people, if you have questions or comments, please put them into the Slido, slido.com #watershed. If you haven't seen that before, you should be able to see it on the bottom of your screen in the bottom bar there. Just go to that site and you can enter questions or comments in. Again, if we don't get to them all today, the project team will have them, and it will be a great resource for us. I have loaded a couple of questions into the Slido for our panel to kind of have a look at and maybe preview. But before we turn to those, as I did following the morning session, I'll just go around to the people on the panel and see if after the course of the presentations today, or if anything else came to mind for you, or anybody said anything that invokes a response or a comment that you'd like to share with everybody joining us today. And maybe I'll call on you one by one, and I'll go in the order you show up on my screen. So Eric, that makes you first. And feel free to say no thanks if there's nothing that jumps to mind, but I'll invite you to offer any comments that you might have.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It was appreciate the invite, and thanks, Jeff, for kind of reaching out and helping kind of nudge me into this opportunity. And I think what I noticed this afternoon was kind of some common threads that went through all of them that I thought were solution-oriented and good guidance for the future. So I was, and there were different levels of presentations. I just thought that it's a good starting point for this conversation today. So I was appreciate and glad to be a part of it. So thanks.
All right, thanks, Eric. Sarah, I'll turn to you next.
Thanks, Jason. And again, thanks, Jeff, for inviting us. It's been really great seeing some familiar faces and obviously revisiting some of these issues and projects from different perspectives, from First Nation perspectives and government perspectives. And like Eric, seeing some really common threads and just really reiterating that importance of both identifying some of these tools and assessment techniques, but ensuring there's that joint planning and collaboration from the first step. So really interested to see how that's put together in this playbook.
Thanks, Sarah. And just seeing that when I was calling on you, I thought I might not have mentioned to all the workshop participants that Shar and Angie had let us know they had other things booked for later this afternoon. So they weren't able to stay with us for the panel, and Rachel is going to have to step off partway through, I think. So if workshop participants are wondering where people went, that's what's happened. But with that, Rachel, I'll see if there were any comments you wanted to make.
Thanks. Mostly it's all being said. I was thrilled that we got to go after, our presentation got to be after Sarah and Shar and Angie, and glad that we could build on that, and glad that we all kind of feel, I think, mostly the same way about that experience. I'm really excited that this group is meeting. I think I said that. Jeff and I were talking quite some time ago, and I was sort of expressing how challenging it was, when we were in the middle of that, trying to build those relationships, figure out this new way of working together, all the other things we were trying to do, and figure out what needed to happen at the same time as we were trying to think about where it should happen and do all the values. And so this idea of a playbook is not meant to, in my mind, not meant to box anyone in, but help us know. For example, I recall being in conversations at Elephant Hill, and we were concerned that the mountains were sliding into the water. Sarah, correct me if this is not what happened in your perspective. And we sort of felt like, well, what should we be doing? What could we be doing? And I think maybe having a bit of an idea through this project, this idea of a playbook, would help folks who are faced with trying to get organized on what should we be doing to recover the land base. Here's some things that are really important for fish and fish habitat. So I'm super excited, and that's kind of the thing that stands out for me after listening to the presentation.
Thank you, Rachel. Sarah, I saw you nodding. I just thought if you wanted to respond to what Rachel said, you could. Otherwise, I'll turn to John.
Yeah, I just wrote down, and this is just what came to mind, but, the value of a playbook is kind of a list of ingredients rather than a recipe. So not this is exactly what needs to happen in this particular landscape or in this particular context, but here is a suite of tools that could be used. And then that decision-making process happening at that kind of local or site-specific level. So yeah, I agree. Rachel heard a lot that having that suite of tools, this is what could work in different contexts would be really helpful.
Well, thanks, Sarah. John, I'll turn to you, and then Jeff, I'll come to you after John.
Yeah, thanks. Something did come to mind to me. I try to be a field forester as much as possible. And in my area, I find that after fire, after disturbance, I've always had the opinion that we can't stop trees from regrowing on our sites. Like vegetation rebounds so quickly here. But that's specific to our location here, and I don't expect that to occur everywhere. So I feel like whatever process we follow, it needs to be at the appropriate scale to manage those differences between ecosystems, and also not just ecosystems, but the people, the stakeholders, the First Nations, the organizations that are in those particular local areas that we're working in are all potentially slightly different too. So yeah, the scale aspect is a consideration from a whole bunch of different perspectives for me.
Thank you, John. Jeff, I'll turn to you, and then Doug, I'll come to you after Jeff.
Thanks, Jason. Well, I guess I'm really grateful for all the presentations and also the dialogues that occurred. It strikes me, and we did know this, but really the ambition is to put a playbook together, but we're not starting from zero at any level. There's been a lot of work done on G2G relationships and collaboration. There's been a lot of work done on what effective planning looks like. There's been a lot of work done on planning tools, the use of GIS. Of course, we heard a lot about different techniques for helping to recover a watershed or treatments that might improve fish habitat. And we also heard some of the science around hydrology and geomorphic risk. So I think we've learned a ton. We'd like to put, in my mind, the playbook really should be about bringing all of that information together in a document that really does not rewrite everything, but that instead tells the basic story of a river and then pulls all that information in and makes it readily accessible, such that if you were the first day on the job and found yourself having to coordinate a team or a planning process that was preoccupied with restoration post-fire, you'd be able to take that manual and have a pretty good idea about all the things and all the complexity and diversity that you need to be aware of, and then know where to go to find the information or who to talk to, because they have an important role in watershed recovery.
All right, thank you, Jeff. And Doug, last word on this part of the panel. Over to you.
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple things that I liked as I was listening to the presentations there. Sarah mentioned, that need for, long-term, thinking about recovery over the long term, in that point coming up. And John's presentation really kind of, as I think about a playbook, started to point out, establishing the zones and setting some objectives for what you want to achieve in those zones, and ultimately monitoring to see that you are achieving that. And we do have the ability to, to spatially like that establish some objectives that we think will be valuable for fish and for watersheds and other ecosystem services, as John pointed out too. That, and I think that's a key part of this and I know that there's a lot more work that continues to go on, as Rachel and Eric alluded to, even in Elephant Hill multiple years after the fire. But it should be guided. Those activities should be guided by a plan and some desired conditions. Really helpful.
All right. Well, thanks for that brief round of panel perspective. I'd like to make sure we try to cover as much of the scope of things that are coming into the Slido as we can. And there's probably, again, another 20 plus questions in the queue here. So I'll do my best to pick the most representative ones. I've got 4 up here, and maybe start with the one at the top. And I will provide a bit of perspective on this, but I'd invite anybody from the panel to add to it. And if you want to comment on this one after I'm done, just give a wave of your hand and I'll turn to you. So the questions around pairing the playbook with more proactive ecosystem / land-based management strategies. And I would say from the Pacific Salmon Foundation side, we agree with that point. But we're trying to be very clear that we're not trying to intrude upon government or First Nations rights, authority, jurisdictions, or necessarily tell anybody what they should do. The idea of this playbook is there are going to be fires, people are going to do things, and there are people with good ideas out there who have learned things, who know things, that have advice or perspective that should be factored in. And we thought it would be useful if we could assemble a version of this all in one place. So the idea of matching it with more proactive and strategic thinking is certainly sensible and logical to us, but we are not at this point actively pursuing that. It's more something that we see as a contribution to the overall response toolbox that would be available for anyone to use. So that would be an opening comment from me, but Jeff, since you're kind of point on this from a project perspective with PSF, I'd invite you to add to that, or in fact, if you take issue with anything I said, feel free to offer your perspective in that regard.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's one of the things that we would have to tackle within the process and within the governance, especially the management level steering committee. We have to develop some boundaries such that we can manage the scope, and as Jason, you said, we don't want to be intruding on areas that are already established. We would hope to provide a playbook that might fit within a broader framework, or at least be useful within the context of a broader framework of responses to fire. So in thinking about things like wildfire resilience and the kind of and how that might play out silviculturally, hopefully we would be referring to what is going on and what is taking place there, at least. But the conversations that will ensue, as I said, we have a highly mutable vision of what the playbook is at this point in time. But hopefully, what we develop through that playbook process will define the scope for us a little more specifically, and we will fit within that broader framework.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Doug, did I see you signaling a thought on this one? Or
yeah, I did. I sort of threw my hand up there. No, I think this is actually a really good. This is a great question, and having the playbook is great, but we have to recognize that it is usually a reaction to an event that's already occurred in that case, and it gives us a playbook on what to do. But I think what's also important, and I think where this question is getting at, is that there are a lot of things that we know that we can do to adapt to climate change that are also good for fish and good for other things that are proactive. So I'm thinking things like upgrading our infrastructure, our road, like for example, our road infrastructure, our culverts, our bridges, to take on larger flows that we know are going to occur, to make sure that we know that these streams, when they do have elevated stream flows, they're going to move. And so having intact riparian areas along fans, alluvial fans, and floodplains where these that are necessary. Those are all things that are really important, that we can do proactively, so that if and when that fire occurs, we can actually there's less we have to react to, I guess, would be my as part of that playbook.
Doug, just to probe that a little bit further, and I ask this because I'm truly not sure, is there anything afoot that is leading towards that people, part of this workshop, would want to know about? Or is that sort of an idea that's out there but doesn't necessarily have any detailed actions or measures to advance it at this point?
That's a good question. I think there are some actions that are ongoing. I think within within the forest industry, licensees and others that are aware of climate change. So I would imagine they're proactively upgrading infrastructure to accommodate some of those flows and dealing with some of those types of issues. Just thinking about those on that scale, as well as there are some initiatives underway to make people more aware of the importance of fans and floodplains, specifically with some of the recent fishery sensitive watershed objectives and guidance that's been put in place, in particular the Thompson Okanagan, but then other outside of things like riparian restoration and other things on private land, I'm not as aware of if there's any initiatives that way.
All right, thanks for that, Doug. Would anybody else from the panel like to comment on this thread? All right. Well, thanks for that one. I'll move on to the next one. It's directed to Eric, so I'll start with you, Eric, but could certainly go to anybody on the panel. Are there considerations made for allowing natural regeneration or planting alternative species as opposed to planting crop species?
So first, I should say I'm not a forester, but I can pass along maybe some of the themes that have been considered, but really my response would be follow up with me with an email, and I'll link you into the smart foresters that work for my group, Nina Siglock and others. But I think that with regards some of the key themes that were discussed at Elephant Hill, and this is how I interpreted some of the conversations, being not a forester, but the type of conversation was stop slamming pine in everywhere, and really we worked with Shequepum to design and figure out stalking standards that were culturally sensitive, as well as being ecologically sensitive. So there was work done there to figure out what are the desired future conditions that we want to see in the land base, what values are we actually managing for, and then how do we use silviculture to actually help meet those conditions in the future. So the signal in the question was crop species, and that is a part of the consideration, but it's not the full consideration now. So we're thinking about managing for multiple values. But if you do want to follow up with me and send me an email, we'll loop you into the kind of the more detailed information that we have from what we did at Elephant Hill. And I don't know where the question is coming from in the province, but yeah, there could be a wide range of appropriate responses, none of which I'm qualified to really provide.
Well, that was a good qualification there, Eric. Thanks. I saw John and Sarah. So John, you go ahead first.
Sure. Thanks. There are stalking standards or legal obligations by licensees, held by licensees across the land base. Some of them have been burnt, and those obligations continue to exist over time, so they need to go in and follow those legally established obligations for those blocks that got burnt. Other non-obligatory areas, I think there's more room in those areas to allow for natural regeneration, non-commercial species. And in some cases, for example, in our area, we leave We leave a period of time between the burning fire before we do surveys and assessments and prescriptions to plant. So 3 or 4 years could go by before we do those activities in order to allow those natural processes to express themselves. And they usually do. Often, in many cases, we're saved a whole bunch of money and expense to not having to plant trees because they've regenerated naturally quite effectively on their own. However, it's a little bit more tricky when you get into a licensee obligation because there's a legal requirement there, and adjusting those is a difficult process. So.
Great, thanks, John. Sarah?
I can add one too.
Yeah, great question. As Eric and Rachel have said, part of the joint work on Elephant Hill was developing those joint silviculture principles, and part of our work with this Lessons Learned project was asking people in Eric's team to give us some of the up-to-date information on, for example, species mix for reforestation. Again, much of that was not necessarily associated with salvage, so there was, in sharing some of those figures with people from communities, they were quite pleased that there was a much lower percentage, for example, of lodgepole pine compared to Douglas fir, which was great. So thinking in terms of coniferous species mix, and then also retention of deciduous species. And the SRSS riparian restoration project that Angie mentioned has a real focus, obviously, because it's in riparian areas on riparian species. So willow, birch as well, alder, as well as some other species like supalelli, also berry, trying to get some of those species back in.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Would anybody else from the panel like to comment on this thread before I move to the next question?
Maybe I'll just ask a question. I'll grab the reins just briefly, Jason, if you'll allow. And I think Eric or perhaps Rachel or Sarah might be able to answer this, but I believe there was and is an ability under FERPA to establish or change stocking standards depending on values and risks that are in play. It is a process, but my understanding is that there's a mechanism for that's conceived under FERPA. But I don't know a lot more about it than that, so I would ask the question. Of Eric or perhaps Rachel or Sarah, because I know you were involved in that. But that's the extent of my knowledge.
Yeah. So this is a very long. We could spend days talking about stocking standards. I'm not a forester, so not qualified to talk about it in any kind of detail. What I can say is that one of the things that's exciting to us with the new change in legislation in BC, so that's Bill 23, the Forest Statutes Amendment Act, has brought in some pretty transformational changes to the Forest and Range Practices Act. A couple of those things, so still need regulations and figuring out how it's going to work. It only just got royal assent at the end of November. Two things. One is there's going to be the ability for the chief forester, so that's government, to establish an area of catastrophic damage. And within that area, we'll be able to do things pretty differently. And I'm excited about that because I think it'll allow us to do some of the things that we're trying to do and kind of got to do in Elephant Hill. So I think that's exciting and something to keep your eye on how that kind of plays out. But I think it'll allow us to build landscape level reforestation plans as opposed to where John was saying, where licensees have obligations, you kind of got to put it back exactly the way it was. So I think there's some really neat opportunities there. And there was another piece and I forgot, maybe it was just about forest landscape planning. So this is my pitch that one of the most exciting things about the updates, the Forest and Range Practices Act, is that what has been introduced is the new forest landscape planning framework or regime, which will replace forest stewardship plans. What that will allow us to do is work. I noticed one of the first questions was about, this is all very good for recovery, but what about more proactive planning? I think this is going to be a forum where we're going to be able to work in partnership with First Nations and on what we want the land base to look like in the future. How is it going to be more resilient in the face of climate change? What are the things, how do we manage for multiple values, and how do we do that at a meaningful sort of tactical level or watershed level basis? So that is what brought me to work for the Office of the Chief Forester. I'm super excited about it, and I would be happy to come back anytime and talk about it without monopolizing. And I will just take this opportunity to say thanks so much for inviting me. And in 2 minutes, I'm going to have to drop off. I really appreciate it. And those of you, my Elephant Hill friends, it was lovely to see you again.
Well, Rachel, appreciate you sticking with us, and I know you have to go, but thanks for joining us today. It was really appreciated.
Yeah, hope you have a great rest of your conference.
Thanks. Anybody else have anything burning on this one? Is that you, Eric? Go ahead.
Maybe I'll just add a sentence that there is a process. It's not a short process, but there is the ability to alter them through that process, and addressing climate is a big piece of that, but not really qualified to speak to the details once again. But we can maybe follow up with I don't know if there's an opportunity to kind of post Q&As or some follow-up from us or our staff later, but can definitely get that information to the audience here.
Well, certainly, I would say just on that, in terms of the mechanics of things, Jeff and I, on behalf of the PSF, would be very willing to be a bit of an intermediary to get any information from any of our speakers or attendees at the workshop out, or to send anything back in through. So feel free to use us if you don't have the contact information for people that you want to get to, and we're happy to use our network to move information around. I'll turn back to the Slido questions. I'll go to the Doug Lewis one. I think it's been up there a bit longer. So Doug, we'll start with you, but we'll go to others on the panel as with the other questions. How does all of your indicator-based work proof out on the land? I see that the elements at risk are half of the equation in your risk-based approach, which is telling. Without an element at risk, there is no risk, yes?
Kind of a couple questions there. The first one, I think, how does it proof out on the land? So in the development of the protocol, some of the people that were involved had a lot of experience in doing watershed assessments in a number of these watersheds in advance. And so a lot of it was based on their prior knowledge of those systems as well. We've also, that photo that Eric showed with the group doing some riparian training, we also did some follow-up from after the Elephant Hill wildfire, looking at stream condition in different watersheds that had been affected, that we expected to respond differently, higher hazard ratings for stream flow versus lower. And I think for the most part, those conditions really did play out consistent with the assessment procedure. So yes, we are kind of seeing that on land. In terms of elements at risk, I think there are elements at risk in every watershed, right? If we just think about fish and aquatic ecosystem health, that's something that we're concerned about everywhere. So often when we're using the results of this, we often just kind of focus on the hazard ratings as our risk ratings for the most part. And when we think about consequence, we may think about, it takes into consideration things like the sensitivity of that element, its exposure, its vulnerabilities, some of those kinds of things, which sometimes we don't have information on. And sometimes it's worth, is this fish stock particularly more valuable than somewhere else? And those are sometimes hard calls to make. So we kind of just often focus on the hazard side of the equation to kind of and use that as risk. So hopefully I don't know if anyone has any other comments.
I'll open that up to the rest of the panel. Any other comments on this question or thread of discussion? Okay, we'll mark that one as cleared, and we'll move on to the next one here. Recovery implies putting things back to the way things were, which Jeff acknowledged may not be possible, and maybe the baseline wasn't all that great to begin with. How does the Build Back Better principle factor into this work? Jeff, maybe I'll start with you, but invite anybody from the panel to add comment to it after you've had a go.
Sure, I liked the the images that I think it was that Gordy provided, perhaps it was Rebecca, around understanding some of the values on the land base before versus more recently, and the fact that maybe what existed most recently wasn't ideal. So that, of course, that was, I thought, a presentation that projected a lot of hope. And so ultimately, I think we want to understand the values on the land base. We want to understand what we want from the land base. We want to consider how we manage that, and we want to approach that through a planning process that works for everyone, and then think about what that desired future state is. And that's where science comes in. I think we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to what is possible and what is cost effective, and what the interplay is between one objective and the others as we move towards a desired future state. And so, and as we do that through time. So it's not just what's going to go on in the next 5 years, but what's going to go on probably when you think about salmon populations in some of these systems, something that goes on over decades. So that's the way I would view that challenge.
Would anybody else from the panel like to comment on this one?
I might just, jump in there. I think, again, recovery implies not necessarily putting things back the way they were, but recovering, sometimes functioning, however you describe or want that to look like. And so in some cases, in the idea of build back better, we may be able to, because sometimes that system gets, so far pushed, like, thinking about things like, you blow a bridge out or a section of road, that you actually have the opportunity to reestablish the functioning of the channel better by by changing the road location or something along those lines that may allow that functioning to improve. And so just being aware of that is kind of really important.
All right, thanks, Doug. Anyone else on this one?
I just think this question comes back to that other question we had earlier about, are we talking about recovery? Are we talking about proactive restoration and management? And so, again, we really need to be thinking with both recovery and restoration, what are we recovering to? And like Doug just said, are we thinking about ecosystem function? Are we thinking about, particular structures or composition? And, what's the kind of historical trajectory and historical disturbance context that wildfire occurred within? And how do we address through wildfire recovery and kind of this opportunity that might present to address some of those kind of underlying, existing disturbances on the land base that contributed to those impacts?
Well, thanks, Sarah. I would say, just from my desk at PSF, the intent in this was not to suggest that after a wildfire you need to rush out and put back whatever was there before. But it was more to say that there's a sense of a need to respond after a wildfire. There's a sense of concern that there could be negative effects. And people do stuff. Forest companies do stuff, landscape managers do stuff, infrastructure managers do stuff, habitat restoration biologists do stuff. People go out and do stuff. And the thinking behind the notion of a playbook was to say, the conditions are changing. What we've been used to, say in the last 40 or 50 years of fire history in BC, does not seem to be what we're going to be faced with into the future. Things are changing. And as such, we don't seem to have something from our past where we've got really good forest research and really good fisheries research that we can go to and say, we've got great habitat restoration manuals that were developed under the Watershed Restoration Program 25 plus years ago. And they were really good, but we're not necessarily sure. You take that and say, there's been a wildfire, go get your Watershed Restoration Manual and head out to that valley and start fixing things. So the idea was more to say, there are going to be fires, things are changing, people are going to do stuff. Can we provide some guidance that will help in terms of what are the needs of salmon and aquatic ecosystems, and putting some sense of a toolbox together that could help with that. And so I hope that helps in terms of people who are participating broadly in the workshop understand what the background intent was. But it certainly isn't to take a narrow view and say, it's not like you broke a window in your house. The window's broken, take it out, go put a new one in, so it looks the same as it did before. So maybe with that, and in the interest of time and trying to cover as much scope as we can, I'll move to the next one. And this is a big kind of statement. I'm not exactly sure how we'll handle it with panel, but I'll invite anybody that has a comment or a view on this to just put your hand up and go ahead. But is the elephant in the room not also that the province of BC has no legal responsibility after wildfire or other catastrophic event to address the loss of watershed resilience? So I think, at least the way I'm reading this, and I hope I'm not reaching too far, is there are kind of 2 points. One is, and they go together. One is around legal responsibility, and the other is an objective of watershed resilience being attached to a legal responsibility. So would anybody like to offer a comment or view on that one? And it's okay if you don't. Go ahead, John.
I probably not the appropriate person to speak to this. I'm a person in the district, and this has got a bit of a political slant to it, maybe to a degree. However, there are some initiatives around managing watershed resilience. I think the government probably does have a responsibility to consider this, and I think that they are to a degree. These things happen relatively slowly, and the proactive approach that you guys are talking about here with the playbook creation and probably the collaborative efforts that are being promoted are part of those aspects of responsibility and delivery towards maintaining resilient ecosystems. But I think it's a little, I think I agree with Wayne, it's a little bit ad hoc, and hopefully things have some focus provided to them, and we're able to deliver something a little bit more organized, objective driven, and we can start to feel like we're actually accomplishing something. I know that's probably not a great answer to the question at a larger scale, but at my level, it would be really helpful to have upper level support and direction for local level planning, delivery, and implementation of restoration activities. And we don't really have that right now. So hopefully that's in the works.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate you stepping out on a limb to take a shot at that one. I know sometimes these things aren't easy between, your professional hat as a biologist and anybody's role working for a government entity. Yeah. Just before I see if anybody else on the panel wants to comment on this, Wayne, we're going to see if we can open up your voice line here in a minute. You're going to get a ping from Derek or Amy to see if you want to unmute. And if you do, if you want to comment further on this, since you raised the point, we'll be happy to do that. And Wayne, if you don't want to, it's okay. But just giving you a heads up that you might get a ping from our Zoom side asking you to unmute, and I'll come to you in a minute. But just back to our panel, would anybody else like to offer a comment or perspective on this kind of this big picture overarching point from Wayne?
Maybe I'll just say a couple words first, and then Doug can go next. And related to Doug's presentation, there's so many different scales of which you could consider this question. Someone that has a house on an alluvial fan below a small watershed that's been severely affected may ask this question. And then, a First Nation community or professionals could ask this question at the bottom end of a massive watershed, which, we've seen through cumulative natural and effects and human-caused activities on the land base has resulted in the watershed not being, functioning the way that that we want, nor the way that the ecosystems want. So I can say, I can't really speak to the legal part of it here, but I can say without hesitation that the government's very interested in amping up our game, in collaborating with First Nations and figuring out how we manage for watershed security and healthy watersheds. I think Doug and I have been working together with regards to cumulative effects and watershed bits and pieces throughout the last decade, and it's been a growing concern of government that has acted in different ways in different places with new objectives to help mitigate, to work with communities in different ways, to do site level work, to do broad landscape level work. So I would say that the trend is that that government's extremely interested in, watershed resilience writ large throughout the province, especially as we face, climate change and other considerations. And everyone's seen kind of what's happened to the Thompson Okanagan area, in November here with a lot of our watersheds getting blown out. So I would say government's been upping their game over the last decade, and will probably take another step here very shortly.
Thanks, Eric. Doug, did you want to comment on this one? I wasn't quite sure if you were waving at that, and then Wayne, I'll come to you after Doug.
Yeah, no, I just quickly. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the province, but certainly, and I'm not sure about legal responsibility, but I just kind of echoing Eric's comments. There's great interest, I think, in this, in the sense of when you look at the costs associated when these large events, catastrophic type of events occur, just the cost to government and the direct cost, as well as the cost to governments, government and First Nations and others in the values that they're concerned about. And so maybe it's a lot less expensive to do some work up front and try to prevent these things than it is to respond to them.
All right, thanks, Doug. Wayne, I think we have your Zoom line opened up. So if you wanted to add to your point here or offer any comment or perspective, we'll give you the floor.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks for the response. This is something that I've been chasing after for the last few years. I think those that know me know I came out of wildfire services. That was my career, or at least the latter part of my career. It's been something that we've long been concerned about. Building a resilient forest is not a new thought. Enacting it is a terribly difficult process. Abbott Chapman, after the 2018, talked about the need for a resilient forest, yet the Chief Forester's Office has been reluctant to change that from a timbered forest to a resilient or a hardwood inclusive. But we don't have a strategic overview after fires to do anything other than guard resilience, putting it to bed, those types of things. So I think it's overdue. I think it is a solution. It's bigger than salmon. It's also, communities, the whole landscape issue. The fire department in Cache Creek, I believe, has had its front doors open twice by floods after Elephant Hill. That prompted something good for us in that locale, but the rest of the province, we need this same urgency that's there if salmon recovery is going to be there. So I'm excited that the question was there. I do think it needs to be dealt with, and I'm pleased that we're finally, our eyes are opening. But it's been the last decade that has been the problem for us in a major way, and so the answer is coming.
Well, Wayne, thank you. Thanks for jumping in. I know I kind of put you on the spot there, but I've known you for a long time, and you've got a lot of experience, a lot of wisdom, and a lot of energy for this issue. So I'm glad that you were able to jump on and share that with us. I'll move on. We're getting close to our wind down time here, and I know that people are probably getting tired. I see our Zoom numbers are slowly dropping, but still lots of people are with us in the workshop today. I'll go to maybe the bottom one here for Doug. And Jeff, I'll kind of tee you up for that middle one there. I'll come to it afterwards. But for Doug, is there any plan to expand this GIS-based indicator approach to other regions or even province-wide?
Yeah, certainly. As I kind of mentioned that in some of my initial slides there, the approach that I spoke to in the Thompson Okanagan has also been replicated in 3 other regions: the Caribou, Kootenay, and Almanica regions. So pretty much covers that particular approach, or close to it, covers most of the central and southern interior of the province currently is available, and there's some contacts there, as well as the Keelan Effects program province-wide is doing an approach that's fairly similar in terms of the use of indicators and to some degree watershed assessments, although the idea of the multi-scale watersheds is still is a bit more of a challenge to do at that scale, at that province-wide scale. So yeah, there's lots out there.
All right, thanks, Doug. I just popped another one in there. It's very specific, but maybe while you're on the hot seat, if I could, is that one that you're in a position to answer in fairly directly? It's asking which hydrologic recovery curve are you using in your latest version of the GIS tool, or is that a big question that takes more time?
Well, it's quick. We are using the most recent hydrologic recovery curve developed by Rita Winkler and others in the assessment. So hopefully that answers this question.
All right.
Which basically, generally, it just it extends it takes a lot longer for stands to recover than the original recovery curve that was available.
Okay, and I suspect just seeing that it's Eunice that's posted the question, he's probably hoping to be provoking our thinking to say, are we subscribing to old traditional dogma in our thinking about hydrology, or are we thinking more about what some of the provocative ways of looking at it that he and his counterparts have been tabling? So, Eunice, thank you for putting that question in. Jeff, I'll turn to you as we kind of get close to the end here. And there's a couple of comments in our Slido, so I've just pulled this one out because I think it covers a few of them. And it says, there are existing playbooks out there that could be used to achieve the objectives you've laid out. Why start from scratch when so much has already been done? And just before you jump in at that, Jeff, there's another one in here. I'll just see if I can find it to kind of add to the mix. It says, in the Kamloops TSA, we use the Elephant Hill guidelines as our playbook for our salvage retention plan. Is the playbook that is being proposed going to be built off those guidelines, or will this be a reinvention of the wheel? So they're sort of similar comments, and I thought it would be good to have a chance to speak to that.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. Well, I guess I would agree that there is a lot of guidance out there. And examples come to mind, like the watershed restoration planning and priority setting guidelines and emphasis on fish habitat. There's also the watershed-based fish sustainability planning, conserving BC fish and fish populations. There's a watershed assessment and management of hydrologic and geomorphic risk in the forest industry. And there's also burned area emergency response treatments. And of course, there's the direction on where one might salvage and where one might not, and how one does so. So there really are a lot of documents out there that do provide guidance, and they're all very good documents, and we would not propose to start from scratch. In fact, we really look to the community to bring to our attention all of the guidance that's out there, all of the most salient guidance, so that we can take advantage of it. We do not want to start from scratch, but we really are looking for the development of a playbook that would not be a rewrite of all those documents, but instead tell the general story of a river or a watershed, and identify everything that one might need to know about how they would participate in a watershed recovery process. And that would talk about, again, the story of the river, the watershed, the tools that are out there, and the techniques, the methodologies, the GIS and decision support tools that are there. That the processes, be that G2G or just integrated resource management planning, the information sources that are out there, the existing guidelines and best management practices, all of those things would be brought together in one playbook. It need not be a massive tome. It could be, we're hoping to keep it between 50 and 80 pages. It would be something that would provide references to the various good guidance that is already out there in electronic format, and allow us to take advantage and leverage on all of that information that's there. And there is also the notion that new science is coming along, and we want to build that into what we're doing. New legislation is coming along. We want to build and bake that into what we're doing as well. And people have asked Doug about the GIS tools. Those things are evolving all the time, and we're gaining new information that can feed into those kinds of processes and building decision-making supports into those kind of processes too. So I think there's a lot of room to build one document that can provide that general overview of the kind of things we need to know about, but it will, when attempting to recover and engage in watershed recovery activities, but it will not be a deep dive on everything that will be involved in recovering watersheds. It will provide that. It will be that reference document that allows people to understand the breadth of the problem or the challenge, and also understand where they can go to seek additional information.
Well, thanks for that, Jeff. And I'll just, go ahead.
No, and I think the Chief Forester's guidelines on salvage activities in for the Elephant Hill Fire is another example of that. That's a standing BMP, if you will, that would be important to acknowledge and take advantage of. And then finally, I would say that there's I think, room to describe the sequence or the order of events that happens through a river's or a watershed's recovery that would allow us to understand how we think about and sequence our activities through time. And so there may be some things we attend to immediately after a fire. That might be dealing with infrastructure risks to infrastructure. That might be thinking about stabilizing slopes or seeding such that we're minimizing erosion where that may be an issue, versus those things that might be tackled 10 to 20 years out. That might, once a river system settles down and we gain some kind of hydrologic recovery, beyond 20 years for that matter, where we might start thinking about channel morphology and those sorts of things. So it's bringing things together and projecting outwards in time as to how we behave.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Jeff. And I'll just reinforce, I see your hand up there, Eric, I'll come to you in a sec, that the intent from what we're undertaking at the PSF is not to reinvent a wheel, but as far as we're aware, there is no one place where all of the best information is brought together that could be used to inform things that could happen on a landscape after a fire that would help salmon. So that's kind of our intent, but it's not to reinvent things. If something's already there that covers half or 3/4 or 99% of it, we'd be happy to point to that. But so far that's the first thing you look for is, has someone already done this? And there's nothing that covers everything that's popped up so far, but lots of great stuff that we think maybe we could kind of assemble to make it more easily accessible and useful for people. Eric, over to you.
Yeah, very minor kind of point of clarity. The Chief Forester's post natural disturbance retention guidance is in play for the province, not just for Elephant Hill.
All right, thank you for that. I will say I'm going to start turning to wind down now. So I will give our panel members, if you want to have a last word, something really brief, like 20 seconds or less, if you can keep it to that. So not opening a whole new thread, but and thanking you for your time today. And as the conversations unfolded, is there any last thought or idea or point that you would like to make or emphasize or sharpen? I'll just kind of go around, maybe reverse what I did last time. So Doug, I'll start with you.
I don't really have anything more to add or say, but just thank you and for the opportunity to present. and just think that the whole idea of the playbook and where this is going is great. So appreciate the time.
Thank you, Doug. Jeff?
I would just thank everyone for participating. I'd especially like to thank the presenters. And I'd just like to remind everyone that I'm very sincere about the help we require. And please look to the PSF website shortly to, I believe, Jason, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but that's where we could post that information should people want to become involved in, or know of someone who might want to become involved. But we'll sort that out. Available so that we can build up our advisory committee. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. John?
I would just say capacity is an issue in all sectors for delivery of a whole bunch of different things, and appreciate PSF sort of stepping up to provide some leadership here. I think that's great. Appreciate the capacity, and if that can be directed to local solutions around these issues, I think that's much welcomed.
Thanks, John. Sarah?
Just thanks again for the opportunity and the invite to BSRSS to present. And I know Jeff, Angie and I spoke with you about sort of timelines and opportunities for different organizations or individuals to participate in putting this playbook together. So I know the SRSS and I'm sure other organizations would be really interested to hear what opportunities there are to contribute and sort of, what that might look like in terms of time and capacity and resourcing as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Eric?
Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity. I certainly appreciate and support the goal of the conference today. Maybe one little piece to add in, since we all had to skip over the pond a little bit, is that we've shown some nice tools here today, and whether it's for wildfire recovery or for just managing the land base, we're using those tools in concert with multiple lines of evidence and inventories and assessments at different scale, and figuring out how to weave that piece of indigenous knowledge into providing kind of robust solutions, whether it's wildfire or just our normal work. So anyway, it was great to have the opportunity to go over a little bit of that today, and definitely support further conversation on your goal here.
All right, well, thank you, Eric, and thank you to everybody on the panel.